Please pray with me. Gracious God, may the meditations of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be a pleasing offering to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. A farmer was working out in his field when a car of several federal agents drove up. They told him that they'd be searching his farm. And he said, "Okay, but whatever you do, don't go in that field." And he pointed. They said, "We're the federal government. We go wherever we want to." With the same quiet calm, the farmer shrugged his shoulders and said, "Okay." He went on with his work, and the agents moved over his farm. And you might already know how this story ends. Later, as the farmer was working near the field he told the agents to avoid, he witnessed a whole lot of federal agents running for their lives from a very angry bull. I told him not to go there. Whether it's a group of arrogant feds being warned away from a dangerous animal or a child being warned away from a hot stovetop, we know how that story ends. The agents encounter the bull, and the child burns their hand. We humans have trouble with limits. We don't tend to like them, even when those limits are erected to protect us. We're always testing the limits. We're always breaking boundaries. Now, our first reading comes from the book of Genesis. This section is that's often called the Garden of Eden story. Humans are created and placed in a garden to take care of it. God tells the man, the woman hadn't been created yet, that he can eat of the fruit of every tree. But then, in this rather awkward sentence construction, then follows that statement with, except for, not the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God tells the man that the day he eats of that tree, he will die. If there's one thing you learn from reading mythology, it's that when a supernatural being tells a human being not to do something, that human will end up doing it. It happened with Pandora and Psyche in Greek mythology, and it happens here with Adam and Eve. Now, the story does take an interesting turn, and it involves a talking snake, no less. But the story ends the way we expect it to. The humans eat from the forbidden tree. They just couldn't stay within that divinely set limit. We're told that their eyes were opened, and they knew that they were naked. They were given one commandment in paradise, and they blew it. Our reading from Romans refers directly back to the Garden of Eden story. Paul argues that sin entered into the world because of Adam's action, and with sin came death. And since we all sin, death comes for us all. Paul reasons through a kind of analogy here, from a lesser situation to a greater situation. If sin and death entered through one man, the lesser situation, then the grace of one man, the greater, Jesus Christ, brings justification. Jesus brings the gift of righteousness and the gift of life. One man's disobedience is rectified by one man's obedience. Notice the onus is on Adam's action here, not on Eve's. And our last text comes from the Gospel of Matthew. That's this Gospel's version of Jesus' temptation. This comes right after Jesus' baptism in the story. I know that's a bit backwards. We're actually a little bit further along the story now. We're kind of going back. But Lent always likes to start with the story of Jesus' temptation. So blame the creators of the Revised Common Lectionary. Jesus is going to be out in the wilderness for 40 days. And how long does Lent last? 40 days. And he's fasting the whole time. This time the text explicitly tells us that the tempter is the devil/Satan. And the devil tempts Jesus 3 different times. And notice that in the third temptation, the gospel writer makes clear that they believe that Satan is the power behind the Roman Empire, and in fact all human realms. It's just kind of slipped in there. But the audience would have immediately picked it up. But Jesus successfully avoids those temptations. Now, the temptations were to do things that of themselves aren't evil. In fact, Jesus would later do many of the things that he was tempted to do here. Feed the hungry, reveal his glory, or even exercise dominion over this world are things that the Son of God has a right to do. The point was that he didn't do those things for his own ego. He did them for the benefit of the community, for the upbuilding of the love of God and the love of neighbor. Jesus stayed within his proper limits, which humans had a hard time doing. The Garden of Eden story tells us that God gave humans a beautiful home and boundaries that they needed to preserve. We're never really told why God set that particular limit, but the details aren't really important. But the boundaries are broken practically as soon as they're set. Adam and Eve just couldn't resist. And unfortunately, defining limits doesn't end with Adam and Eve. Humanity ever since has been pushing limits. A significant theologian from the middle of the 20th century once wrote, "Man also remains a creature, and his sin arises from the fact that he is not satisfied to remain so." Now, I'm not agreeing that all sin arises from that fact, merely that much of sin does. For so long, male theologians have placed the origin of sin as pride, ignoring the fact that some people, often women, instead of puffing themselves up with pride, go the other direction and diminish themselves to make themselves less than. But either direction is a violation of the proper place, of the proper limits. And we covet what doesn't belong to us: land, resources, people. We constantly want more. We want bigger. We want better. Newer, shiny, keeping up with the Joneses, all that good stuff. And our nation states claim power over life and death and the right to determine what is right and what is wrong based on national interest. A blatant disregard for God's rightful authority, and our duty to love all people, regardless of nationality, as our neighbors. And I think many rulers realize that, so that's why they take religion and they use it to justify it themselves. God is on our side, they might say. And they make sure the cameras are rolling while they pray or while they go to church. But God isn't a human being. God doesn't fall for that, and neither should we. And I'm sure you could all name many examples where we humans exceed our rightful limits, where each one of us exceed our rightful limits. The environment is one that's pretty important right now. We know that there is a finite limit on what the earth can provide for us at any point in time, but we're determined to do what we want anyway. And we see children constantly pushing back against the boundaries that are set for them. I was listening to the radio about how cell phones are now banned in public schools here in Oregon. And part of the story talked about how many kids have become adept at skirting that prohibition. But of course, adults are not exempt from violating limits either. Need I remind people that the speed limit downtown is 20 miles an hour? And stop signs mean stop. Now, last Wednesday, Ash Wednesday, I imposed ashes on the foreheads of everybody who was here. And I said these words: "Remember that you are dust, and to the dust you shall return." Truth is the first step towards reconciliation. We have to know who we are before we can reconcile with God and reconcile with each other. We have to begin by declaring openly that we are human and we aren't God. There are limits that we just cannot cross. We must acknowledge our shortcomings and strive to do better. We must always love God and love neighbor without exception. And that is not an easy thing to do. But the good news of the gospel is that God gives us the ability to become better. Notice that Paul talks about justification and righteousness together. We aren't just declared righteous. We are actually becoming righteous. Take that, Lutherans. God is making us right with God and with each other. The birth, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ has brought a transforming power into humanity. And we don't become God, sorry Athanasius, but we do become truly human. So we humans, we have a terrible time with limits and boundaries. We're always trying to break them. But we need to find a way to, well, we don't need to find a way. God has given us that way. God has given us a way to avoid breaking those boundaries. We follow the example of Jesus Christ, which directs us to love of God and love of neighbor. And we acknowledge who we are. We're humans. We're not God. We don't have all this power that we like to think we do. And we recognize that God has given us the ability through the person of Jesus Christ to live out our lives as God would have us live with each other in love for God and neighbor, and live within our boundaries, not touching the hot stove.